Chapter 29, Culmination 5. Chapter 11, Culmination 5. 1997-1998. Percy is 21 and 34, Severus is 36, Harry is 17, and Dumbledore no longer lives. Percy awakes alone, of course, in his wide and clean bed. He wakes alone, and he wakes suddenly, the spell slipping from his body cleanly and smoothly, and his eyes opening just seconds later. For several blissful seconds, Percy luxuriates in the false comfort of spell-induced sleep. His face, normally raw and puffy in the morning, head throbbing with latent exhaustion, a scream of self-pity rising in his throat, a hopeless lament against the unfairness of needing to emerge into yet another miserable day, is smooth when he reaches a finger to prod cautiously at the bags under his eyes. Then, the memory. Percy drops his hand, as if burned by the thought of Tom's fingers where his had just been. His cheeks flame with agony. Oh, Merlin. That he'd so whimperingly whispered for Tom to take him home, that he'd let Tom all but tuck him in like he were a child, that he'd laid there like a maiden in an old tale while Tom leaned over him, and Percy propels himself out of bed, unable to bear even the memory of the events of last night. His blood cools slightly during a frigid shower, and he forgoes a hair-drying charm so that his head continues to feel cold as he tentatively makes his way into the other room. Empty, thank Merlin. Even the sight of the empty frame hanging in its prominent spot on the wall makes Percy blush again. He leaves without preparing his customary cup of coffee and plain bowl of porridge, though his stomach grumbles as he arrives in the ministry, submitting tensely to the customary identity check before making his quick way to the minister's office. Empty, thank Merlin. Well, Pewes is there obediently, because Percy had commanded him to arrive each day at 5 in the morning and sit quietly until Percy arrived closer to 6. But Pewes in this state does not count as a person. Without even the traditional stirrings of guilt in his stomach at the sight of Pewes, blank, empty eyes, Percy dispatches the minister to patrol the halls, commanding him to go to all of the department heads' offices and stand silently in each doorway for 30 seconds before shaking his head and leaving, which hopefully will cause a frisson of discontent among the senior staff and also keep Pewes out of Percy's hair. Unfortunately, this leaves Percy alone in the office, and thus alone with his thoughts. Burning, blushing, flaming cheeks, Percy cannot bear to think of it. Was he truly so desperate for Tom's attention? Did Tom think a kiss, truly the best weapon to use on Percy? Why had Percy given him that impression? Was it true? It was a weapon, right? A calculated effort to ensure Percy's loyalty. Surely Tom had not meant it right. Percy reaches for the notebook to inform Severus of what had occurred, and then stops short, unable to even begin to articulate the earlier events of the day without thinking of the later ones. And Percy absolutely will not, could not, should not tell Severus that Tom had kissed him. The thought of saying those words to Severus fills Percy with such a prolonged sense of panic that he slams the notebook closed and looks around him for a place to hide. Focus, he roars at himself angrily, hating the way that his thoughts buzz agitatedly around his mind. His mental library, when he takes a peek in it, is in disarray, like the Hogwarts library in the days before the final exams, books half open and strewn around the long wooden tables. He has to focus. They had made contact with Harry, revealed themselves to the trio, found Draco Malfoy, and destroyed the diary, and Percy is focusing on what was undoubtedly an artless attempt at manipulation instead of any of those more pressing matters. He spends the next hour focusing on these priorities. He writes a very brief summary for Severus, with an obvious set of omissions of what had occurred. He leaves a note for Tonks, telling her that he'd seen Harry, who would hopefully now trust his earlier instruction to go to Andromeda, and also that Harry may think Percy possessed, which was far from the truth, and sends an order to the Ministry Library to reserve some books on famous seers of England. Then Tom comes nearly tumbling through the door, an expression of boyish excitement preceding him, and Percy flushes hotly and goes cold within seconds of each other. But of course, Tom does not do anything as obscene as insinuate in any way that he wishes to kiss Percy again, though he stops when he sees Percy and bestows upon him a quick, silver smile. "Look," Tom says eagerly, snapping his fingers with a bit of his diary self's theatrical flair. Percy shivers, but this time because the temperature in the room plummets rapidly to below freezing. It is not a spell, but rather Tom's magic, leaping to do his bidding. After gasping past the initial shock of the chill, Percy can sense, like a great ancient glacier with its swooping, razor-sharp lines hiding an immense mass of ice, the undercurrent of Tom's control. "Merlin," he breathes, looking up at Tom with wide, impressed eyes, despite his earlier resolve to be professional and aloof. Tom has always had exquisite control of his magic, but this is something else entirely. "Tom, your magic, it's changed. I think I may be the most powerful wizard alive," says Tom triumphantly, and Percy cannot even disagree. "My magic, of course." Tom snaps his fingers again, and his magic roars in response, sending an icy breeze through the office, the curtains billowing like waves crashing onto shore, icicles crystallizing on the light fixtures. "But my soul, too." Percy flinches automatically, ready for some show of power to accompany the words, but nothing changes, despite Tom's exultant expression. And now that some of his embarrassment has receded, he can think again of his realization yesterday that Tom had not absorbed the diary's soul, only its magic. But Tom must think he had taken the soul from the Horcrux into his own. He must think this heady rush of magic flowing through his veins is from soul and magical core both. What does that mean for Percy? Nothing, he supposes, watching Tom all but cavort around the office, demonstrating his newfound powers as giddily as a child in Fred and George's shop. Nothing, except that perhaps Tom does have a blind spot, for all that Percy does not know how to exploit it. Percy mourns the diary, in his own way, tracing his fingers over the faded photograph of Tom that he'd copied from the Hogwarts periodicals all those years ago, the knowing gleam in his eyes, the group of sycophant boys laughing obediently behind. His soul feels emptier when he grips the stone tightly in his palm and soars over the tops of the great fir trees to land at the astronomy tower. It feels cold and empty and alien to him without Tom's misty form, but his soul still casts shadows. But when he walks through Hogwarts, slowly, deliberately, trailing a hand over the banisters like he'd used to, even back in his head boy days, something still lurks behind the quiet creaking of the stairs. Something like discontent, something like unhappiness. Yet he cannot find it, even as he commands his soul to shine lights into the dusty and dim corners, even as he returns again to the blistered stone marking Fred's final joke. Something is still wrong, but now that he knows it is not Tom, he supposes it can only be himself. Despite Percy's instructions to Tonks, he does not hear from her, nor Andromeda, nor any of the four errant teenagers now careening undeniably toward the end of the war, one way or another. When Percy forces himself to rewatch the memory of those critical final moments, he'd been oddly touched by the way that Ron had stepped quickly to his side, brushing off Hermione's attempt to restrain him. But then Percy has to flinch at the possessive expression that crossed Tom's face in response. Perhaps he ought not to be surprised that the trio has not contacted him, perhaps believing him controlled by a Horcrux. Undoubtedly, it had been as odd of a day for them as they were likely to have. But only 2 days after he writes to Severus, the other man finds a way to summon him to Hogwarts, ostentatiously to discuss that Ginny has disappeared from the grounds, but more pointedly to hear the events of the past few days. Percy will have to make some excuse to the Dark Lord, he supposes, for his sister's behavior. Severus tells him, ensconced in a room in the Three Broomsticks, Percy is trying not to think of Madame Rosmerta's accusing glare, and the way she handed over the key with more force than was strictly necessary, and her once pretty face lined with worry and resentment, that he is fairly certain that Ginny and the rest of them are hiding in some protected spot of the castle, perhaps a chamber of Gryffindors, or a classroom they'd managed to thoroughly enchant. They have clearly not left the grounds. Instead of attending their classes, they seem to be taking a rather more extracurricular approach to their learning, making things difficult for the Carrows, who are nearly blind with anger as they attempt to ferret out the hiding students. "In truth, I am trying not to know where they are," Severus says quietly, and Percy nods in understanding. Every piece of knowledge that they carry in their mental shields weighs more heavily on their minds, exposing them to risk, a hook for their unbreakable vows to catch on during torture. Ginny makes it through this war alive, Percy tells himself, as do most of the other students who are presumably in hiding with her. Now tell me, your message was not complete. Percy flushes automatically, despite himself. Severus eyes him carefully and then sits up more alertly, his brow furrowing, as he reads some truth on Percy's face. Percy's blush intensifies at the intimacy of having Severus, full attention on him, roving over his face, his tortoiseshell glasses, the zit on his nose that he'd assiduously hid with a layered glamour charm. Well, Percy begins awkwardly. First steps first. Tom forced a confrontation between the diary, which was, as I had said, with Harry, and fully alive. He stops, his flush continuing to the tips of his ears, but releasing his cheeks from its hostage. Severus acknowledges the point with a gentle dip of his head. The gesture is oddly soothing to Percy, who feels some of his earlier anger at Severus' lack of trust dissipating into the wind, as you'd suspected. I suggested to Tom that he use their magic to decide which of the two soul fragments ought to be dominant, and the other Tom agreed to this plan, Severus says in surprise. Percy hesitates and then nods, thinking how Tom had seemed to know the suggestion was coming. I believe the diary thought it a foregone conclusion that he win any confrontation of magic, Percy says thoughtfully. As the first Horcrux, it has the most powerful fragment of soul. Severus frowns. Yet the other, Tom, won. It was a battle of magic, Percy explains slowly, trying to put into words the strange, brittle confrontation and Percy's sudden flash of understanding. Their magic recognized each other, but Tom, the diadem Tom, had more control over his, and he was able to overpower the diary. Severus leans back and regards Percy thoughtfully. But you suspect it was not a battle of their souls. Tom's soul, the diary Tom, was sheltering in mine, I suppose, Percy says awkwardly, unable to describe their connection without using Tom's words and thereby calling to mind the events that had followed. I felt Tom snapping the connection between us, and I felt when the diary's soul was destroyed. It released quite a lot of magic, which Tom absorbed into himself. And you believe this significant? Severus asks shrewdly. Caught, Percy coughs out a quiet laugh, searching for the right words. He thinks he absorbed the diary's soul, but he only absorbed its magic. I am not precisely sure what that means for us, but it feels important. Severus is quiet, considering the implication of what Percy had said. Percy falls into silence as well, examining Severus, who looks, as always, tired and grim. His face is so different than Tom's, so much older, and yet in a curious way, so much more alive. At times, Tom still reminds Percy of a painting, the strokes of his face called deliberately into being, rather than organically rendered. I will defer to you, Severus says finally, surprising Percy, who adjusts his glasses nervously. Severus scowls at the gesture and elaborates, as your understanding of soul magic is considerably more advanced than mine. Percy opens his mouth to disagree. Severus raises an eyebrow, and Percy sheepishly closes his mouth. For Severus to say such a thing is a precious gift, and Percy will not scorn it by disagreeing without cause. Perhaps Severus is right. Perhaps Percy's understanding of soul magic is more advanced than Severus, and Tom's, and McGonagall's too. It is an odd thought to see himself standing in line with these giants of his life, and it makes his stomach churn uncomfortably with a combination of anxiety and pride. The locket is with Andromeda, and I hope I sent Harry there, though I have heard nothing, Percy continues. Oh, and Draco is with them too, presumably of his own accord. Tom did not confront Potter then. Severus asks curiously, though his face registers surprise at the belated news that his godson is now in league with Harry Potter. Nor followed him to the locket. Percy can't help it. He flushes again, hating his skin and his light complexion, and wondering if there is a spell he can employ to keep his body temperature regulated. I was affected negatively by the confrontation with Tom, Percy says weakly, looking over Severus' right shoulder to avoid the force of his gaze. I told him I needed to come home. He was concerned about me. I see. The silence produced by these words is unbearable. Percy reluctantly drags his eyes back to Severus, only to find the other man's expression inscrutable. Perhaps Severus can glean what then followed by the pink tinge of Percy's cheeks. Perhaps he is imagining something far more sordid and unimaginable. Perhaps he is merely calculating how to best use this information to his advantage. But ultimately Severus says nothing, only clearing his throat and changing the topic neatly to that of the prophecy that the Dark Lord has repeatedly demanded they bring him. So when we destroy the locket, which you said in your message requires Parseltongue, we will contend only with Potter, Tom, and the Dark Lord. Do you still think it wise to encourage the Dark Lord to directly attack Potter? Do you? Percy says, voice tinged with petulant anxiety. I thought you said that Dumbledore has insisted on it. So he has, concedes Severus, and I believe he hopes such a confrontation will destroy the Horcrux within the boy without harming the boy thus. Do you think this likely? Well, presumably by now Harry has beaten Draco in a duel, Percy says contemplatively. He does not know how, precisely, Draco won the trio's trust and joined their journey, but he cannot imagine it occurred without a duel. Or perhaps we can arrange one if needed. We have the Elder Wand to give to Harry. He has the cloak, presumably. I do not know about the Resurrection Stone, but we must assume that if Dumbledore truly planned for Harry to command the Hallows, he would have given it to him. Percy trails off, his stomach clenching in dread as he remembers something important. The will, he breathes out, looking at Severus with wide, panicked eyes. Perhaps the items in the will were meant to lead Harry to the stone. Do you have these items? Percy starts and nods, digging into his ubiquitous book bag for his moleskin pouch, which has a nifty resizing charm on it that expands its capacity. He withdraws the items, the book, the snitch, the little muggle toy. Severus picks up each in turn, examining them silently, though he seems to come to the same conclusion as Percy had. None were magical objections, at least not inherently, the snitch no longer animated, the toy nothing more than cool metal against their palms. This last seems to fascinate Severus. He picks it up gingerly and spends a very long time staring at it, his expression complex, as if it speaks to some memory of his long forgotten, perhaps a childhood memory in an unhappy muggle home. Percy takes the book to shield himself. But then, as Percy flips carefully through the Book of Myths, a memory. His mother, in the downstairs room, sitting in the large, squishy red armchair that Percy had secretly loved so dearly. His brothers gathered around in their established order. Percy and Charlie on the couch, Bill perched smoothly on the armrest, Fred and George leaning against Percy and Charlie's knees, and the two youngest on pillows on the rug, closest to the fire. Their father in the corner, tinkering softly with some muggle invention. All attention on their mother, her voice animated as she takes on voices for each character, at times adding her magic to the mix, so that a spark of light flashes as a wizard casts a spell, or a puff of smoke startles Ginny and Ron, who clutch at each other fearfully. A particular story that Percy had never liked, so he'd never requested it. Three brothers, a bridge, an image of death like a large, scary Dementor, extending a scaly hand. Severus, he says slowly. Severus does not respond at first, still cradling the silver muggle toy like it is precious, or perhaps hated. Severus, Percy repeats with more volume. At Severus' inquisitive gaze, he turns the book around, thinking of Bathilda Bagshot and her surprise that he'd not heard of the Hallows and a grave in cemetery, lying beside generations of Dumbledores and Peverils and the parents of the boy who lived. What are you showing me? Severus asks impatiently, scanning the page, as Death reaches up to the elder tree. The Hallows, Percy says, taken aback. Tales of Beedle the Bard. Severus' voice is laced with impatience. I do not know this book. Tales of horrid muggle childhood indeed. Percy is briefly embarrassed by his presumption, but he shakes it off long enough to say, it is a story of the Hallows, though I did not think of it at first. My mother used to read it to us as children. If Ron were to read this book again, he would remember, and perhaps Hermione would think to wonder if they were real, given Harry's cloak. This must be what Dumbledore intended to pass on to them. We must give these gifts to them, Severus says, setting the silver item with some reluctance on the table. What is that? Percy asks, nodding to it. Dumbledore left it to my brother. It is a deluminator. It removes light from a location and stores it for use. I have seen Dumbledore use it often. Severus anticipates Percy's next question and says quickly, I do not know why Dumbledore wanted Ronald to have it. Perhaps for the cave, so that they may remove the lights that may awaken the Inferi. I believe the true gift is, as you said, the Book of Stories. The snitch and the deluminator are merely decoys. They need to find Harry again anyway, though without the diary, Percy is not sure how to best achieve this goal. Regardless, he nods and packs away the things carefully, asking as he does so, "But the resurrection stone, it is still missing." "We must assume that Potter already has it, or knows how to get it," Severus says with a heavy sigh. "The Hallows are not our concern. We are merely conjecturing that Potter needs them for his task. Perhaps the boy must die, and to have hope otherwise is fruitless." It brings us back to my original query. If the Dark Lord is to kill the boy, then whichever of he and Tom win their inevitable confrontation will be ours to defeat. "I do not think it wise to have them face off now, if that is what you are implying," says Percy, shaking his head. "Tom has become far more powerful magically than he was by absorbing the diary's magic. I think we need to let the prophecy come to play and then evaluate our next move. Whichever of them survives will be mortal if the Horcrux within Harry is defeated as well. At that point," Severus nods soberly, "so we must continue to instill in the Dark Lord's mind that he must try and defeat the boy before anything else, and we must convince the boy that he ought to go to his death willingly." "He will," says Percy softly, "if we tell him that there is no other choice. The Dark Lord will be eager to defeat Harry if Harry appears and is vulnerable. So we must only convince Tom that it is in his best interest to wait. I can manage the Dark Lord." Severus looks steadily at Percy. "You must contain Tom, distract him with whatever tools are at your disposal. It will take time for us to find Potter and use him to destroy the locket." Percy nods, the tips of his ears flaming red yet again. Certainly Severus does not know what he had just implied to Percy, and so Percy will carefully not think of it. To distract them both, he says impulsively, "Which of the Hallows would you want if you were offered them?" "The wand," says Severus, as if it were obvious. "To speak to the dead while enticing," he trails off, and the shadow of Lily hovers between them before he shakes his head to clear it. "The wand, so that I may have power unchallenged. And you?" Percy thinks having unconquerable power, of being able to speak to death, and then of Tom's gaze, fierce and arresting and inevitable. "The invisibility cloak," he says quietly, "so that I may disappear." Percy risks another letter to Bill several months after his last. William, he writes carefully, hoping that Bill still understands the cue. "Have you heard from Ron? I am worried about him. Ginny has disappeared from Hogwarts. They are purebloods. They have nothing to fear. I want to ensure they are safe." Percival, but Bill does not reply either. Where in Merlin's name did these teenagers go? Did they not know how to get to Andromeda's house? Surely that would not be a task too difficult for the four of them. Or had they told Andromeda something so shocking about Percy that they had elected not to trust him any further? Distracting Tom, at least, is an easier task. Percy dares him to do harder and harder feats of magic, to see how many items he can levitate simultaneously, to summon large boulders from many meters away, to test the boundaries of a reparo charm on porcelain dust, shattered carefully by an applied exploding charm. First-year tests, Hogwarts tests, but tests that entertain Tom, just as Percy had thought they might. Nothing is said about the kiss, of course. Percy has begun to think that he'd imagined it, somewhere in the fevered drowsiness of his mind. That his thoughts may have conjured such a thing of their own accord is, of course, unthinkable, and so Percy chooses not to think of it when he can. Not to think of the kiss, or how dizzy and intoxicated Percy sometimes feels, so close to Tom's magic, as if his mind is not his own, as if his body is controlled by another. No, there are many things that Percy does not think of, carefully and deliberately. But despite the fact that neither wizard mentions the kiss, that moment of weakness, there are other moments that are uncomfortably confusing, if not agonizingly intimate. Like the gifts that Tom acquires for Percy, acquires being the operative word, since Tom steals them without any shame. Some items, like the dragonhide wallet with a clever animation charm on an engraved dragon, he silently pickpockets from the target with a silent, deadly summoning charm. Others, like the set of pure gold goblets inlaid with shimmering crystals, he takes from whatever residence he is in for his own private, untold reasons. Tom does not present these to Percy explicitly as presents. He brings them to the flat as spoils of war, but leaves them there in Percy's possession. Percy quickly learns that the way to avert an extended sulk is to loudly praise the gifts upon their giving and display them prominently thereafter. Or the walks that Percy now takes with Tom, who seems to exult in his own body in a way that Percy, for whom exercise is a nuisance, or more often an obligation, does not fully understand. But when Tom discovers that Percy has begun walking most of the way home after work, enjoying the quiet, still night and the hordes of blissfully ignorant muggles, he begins to join him, and they walk next to each other in such a way that Percy is intently aware of the proximity of their hands. What does it feel like to absorb another soul into yours? Percy asks quietly on one of these walks, the silence between them looming so large that Percy feels compelled to break it. He mustn't suggest to Tom that he'd absorbed only magic, not soul, but Percy cannot help but be curious. Tom is silent until a muggle couple, pausing to smile at each other's faces under the warm pool of light cast by the brass muggle light post, passes by them. Percy had been initially hesitant about telling Tom about his route, but Tom watches the muggles more curiously than hatefully. "It feels as if I could breathe more clearly," says Tom after a long, thoughtful pause. "As if a pressure on my chest has been relieved. I feel more powerful, of course. I can feel my magic all throughout my body. And you feel stronger. Worlds stronger," breathes Tom, almost reverently. "The diary, it was a stronger soul piece than the snake." The animal soul was interfering, I believe. "Do animals have souls?" Percy asks curiously. Certainly he's not heard of animals fleeing from dementors. Tom wrinkles his nose. "Of a sort. A bit like muggles, I think." Percy considers this. Continuing to use dementors as a metric for whether something has a soul, he supposes that muggles cannot even see the creatures. Do dementors harm muggles? So you believe only magical creatures have a soul? "Of course," Tom says pityingly. "I know you are not as familiar with soul magic as I, but this ought to be obvious. Our souls are nothing more than our magical cores." "But," Percy begins, frowning, his steps slowing as he considers this. Despite his desire to engage Tom in conversation, only to determine what he knows, Percy finds himself unable to resist the intellectual argument. "That doesn't make sense. Our magical cores grow and strengthen as we practice magic. And why wouldn't our souls grow the same way?" Tom asks, raising an eyebrow, and Percy has to admit it makes a certain amount of sense. The soul splits at death, and magic is released, enough magic to break the bond of a dementor. A soul is created at birth, and somehow magic is trapped from the world and concentrated in the child. Why wouldn't a soul merely be a receptacle of magic? "Because you've walked through yours," a voice in his head whispers. "Because you know that muggles have souls, and so do squibs. Because a wizard can lose its soul but still be a magical being." "I suppose," Percy says doubtfully. Something inside him is still screaming no at the idea that souls, in all their complexity, are nothing more than magical cores. But he cannot verbalize precisely what a soul would be instead. "Do you believe it will continue to scale, then, if you were to find the locket?" Tom looks curiously at Percy, but answers, "I am planning to keep the locket as a Horcrux, so that it may protect me from harm. I have a form and magic and power. Even if the boy were to defeat him, he would die, as you've said before." Percy nods slowly. "Do you think the boy has the locket?" "No," says Tom, surprisingly calmly. "I did not sense it on him. I believe it is still with Sirius Black in the Black family home. It is no matter, he will not be able to destroy it. I am patient, Percy. I will retrieve it when it is time." "I see." Percy would be willing to posit that Tom would decide it time to fetch the locket shortly after the Dark Lord was dead. "Well, can you do any new types of magic?" "It's not a question of type, rather of strength," Tom begins to explain, though he falls silent in the middle of his comment as another pair of muggles pass them. "Honestly, Percy, you really ought to move. How do you stand this? It's like a zoo." "I like my flat," Percy defends. When Tom gives a scornful smirk, Percy bristles. Searching for something positive to say about his flat, he settles on, "It's the first thing I've ever had that's mine." Tom's face registers surprise, and perhaps even understanding, which simmers in the space between them. "You were not happy as a child," he says quietly, turning to face Percy. The night is particularly dark, the sky an inky black, swathed under a low ridge of heavy glacial clouds, the suggestion of snow nipping at Percy's nose and ears. It is the type of night where Percy cannot tell if his chest is cold due to Tom's magic or the relentless freezing of the world each night, only temporarily beat back by the wan sun each morning. "Are you unhappy now?" Percy's instinct is no. He then thinks about it more fully, weighs this miserable life against the last, and then opens his mouth and says, "No, but I am not happy either." "What are you?" "Tired, I think," Percy says honestly. "But I feel I am, working toward my own goals. Working for myself, rather than a master." "Even though the Dark Lord commands you?" Tom asks shrewdly. "Even though you are working to help me regain my power." Percy gives a helpless shrug, unable to continue to meet Tom's gaze. He looks instead up at the sky, though the moon is nearly hidden behind the thick, heavy clouds. Percy knows Severus well enough by now to know that Severus resents the Dark Lord's orders as much as he did Dumbledore's, though he'd likely say it was for a different reason. Harry likely resents the Dark Lord, too, and Hermione, and Ron, and Draco. And the Dark Lord is the reason that Landon is dead, and the reason that Percy's classmates live in fear, and the reason that Percy has become so intimately familiar with both sides of a Cruciatus curse. But the Dark Lord is the reason that Percy is here, too. He is the reason that Percy ended his old life with a twist of golden dust, carefully extracted from one of the remaining time-turners found in the back of the Library of Archives. The utter, all-encompassing conviction that the Dark Lord needs to be defeated is at the center of all of Percy's decisions, even as Percy begins to understand the Dark Lord better and pities him and empathizes with his decisions. Percy has never had that kind of clarity, not in his last life. In this life, Percy is so proximate to power that he sees it all unfold in front of him, which makes him feel often hopeless. But sometimes it makes him feel that he is his own master, and his goals are his own, and his power is at his own command. The second goal obviates the pressure of the first, Percy says, instead of trying to explain all of that to Tom, who he can't imagine ever understanding, not having conviction in himself. Helping you has helped me discover a version of myself that I liked, or at least that I could respect. I've never had that before. Tom's look in return feels as intimate as the kiss, and as searing, and as poignant when Percy thinks of it later, absently tracing his fingers over one of the golden goblets that shimmers with trapped candlelight. But still Percy does not feel scared, though he supposes perhaps he should. They are having the funeral anyway, Percy writes to Severus several days later, pressing his quill savagely into the page. A crumpled invitation lays next to him, singed at the tips from where Percy's magic produced an accidental surge of anger. "I warned Henry, but he will not listen. You should inform him. I can't inform him. He will find out anyway." Percy thinks of a young Greengrass boy staring up at the Dark Lord with awe in his eyes, and another boy with the same expression in front of a house ghost. He chokes back a sob Tobias had tried, but Landon would have been safer with Henry and his lot, proud purebloods that nevertheless remained light wizards, or the very least neutral ones. "So I must betray them too," warned Tobias. "Do not attend the raid yourself. It will be difficult for you to bear. You must not risk it. He will want me to attend." The second that the Dark Lord learns that Percy is informing on the illicit actions of his old classmates, he will gleefully, cruelly order Percy to attend, and even cast a killing blow with his own hands. Are Minerva and Phileas invited to the funeral? If not, you should forge them invitations. Why? I will tell the Dark Lord that we will take advantage of their absence to interrogate Trelawney, in case she may be the seer we seek. Then you need not attend the funeral, but the Dark Lord will not risk attacking with both Minerva and Phileas present. Percy blinks at Severus, dark, spiky handwriting, but responds, "So you have decided to pin it on her." He will find it believable. Percy thinks dubiously of the 3 years of divination he had taken, of Trelawney's smoky rooms and plushy couches. He does not think she had ever successfully predicted anything of note during his time in her class, though she did delight in predicting harm for a student on the first day of class each year. She had never noticed Percy, largely because Percy kept his head down and studiously ignored the majority of what she tried to teach them. Severus, perhaps sensing Percy's doubt, continues to write. She is related to Cassandra Trelawney, the famous seer, unless you have an alternate suggestion. No, Percy writes guiltily, thinking of the books he'd gotten from the library but not read. But I believe I have finalized the alternate text after your last revision. This will accelerate matters. Likely we will have only days to arrange a confrontation between those involved once we show the Dark Lord the prophecy. Percy brushes his fingers over the ink, knowing what it is that Severus is implying. To destroy the locket is at least nominally in their grasp, but they had not yet decided how to destroy Tom when the time comes. Let us create the memory. Then we will have it at our disposal when necessary. Having a plan makes it easier to stomach some of the news plastered over the Daily Prophet as January slips into February, and February begins its inexorable campaign toward March. News like Tobias continuing to insist on having a public funeral for his son, despite Percy's risky letter of warning. Other news like Susan Bones tracking down her aunt's murderer and attempting to kill him, only to be seriously cursed herself in the process. And most worrying, news that Lucius Malfoy has been sighted in the country, a flash of blonde hair at Gringotts, which sends the Dark Lord into an incoherent rage at the next Death Eater meeting. I wonder why he has returned, says Tom thoughtfully. Percy shrugs silently. Tonks had asked him the same question when Percy had relayed the sighting, but there was no way to posit Lucius' motivations without speaking of the Elder Wand. He must believe he has found something worthy of inciting his wrath. But the Dark Lord does not tell Percy, nor does Lucius appear at any Death Eater meetings, though they are all very aware of his alleged presence in the country. Percy silently lingers after meetings and smiles non-committally at all of the men he'd grown used to over these past months, and his reward is the unsettling knowledge that many of them would follow Lucius, if Lucius could credibly defeat the Dark Lord. Lucius is familiar to them, after all. The Dark Lord's harsh, elemental magic and impenetrable private goals are confusing and worrying to most of the purebloods who were expecting something more akin to their favored friend being appointed minister than such a violent reign. Lucius plays the same games that they do in the ministry. His son is friends with their sons, though, of course, Draco is still mysteriously missing, presumed to be abroad as well. And his magic, while dark, is a familiar sort of dark, dark out of a mixture of family loyalty and childish defiance to the status quo, in the same way that Auntie Muriel practices the old ways despite her niece's disapproval. It worries Percy, not because he believes that Lucius has come back to challenge the Dark Lord. The more likely reason for Lucius' return is that he found something of note in whatever foreign country he spirited himself away to, perhaps wind of a rebellion, or a friendly or spineless minister who may support the Dark Lord's increasing reign. Tom worries Percy. Tom worries Percy even more now that he has disposed of the diary and absorbed some of his youthful demeanor in addition to his magic. Percy cannot say whether Tom has become more cheerful because the way to power has become ever more clear, or because he took on some of Tom's memories too. Either way, Percy finds himself in the odd position of meeting what feels like a fourth version of Tom. A Tom that Percy may have met at his age in the ministry. A Tom that might have elected to go abroad to do the same curse-breaking program with Bill. A Tom who is undeniably powerful and undeniably charismatic. Percy has never seen Tom interact with another person, so he cannot be sure whether this version of Tom is the version of Tom that everyone would see, or if Percy, for some reason beyond his understanding, is being delivered this version of Tom deliberately, whether out of trust or artifice. Regardless of why, Percy is worried, and it gnaws at his stomach. Tom smiles at him. Tom smirks at him and grins at him and laughs at him, far more openly than any version of Tom that Tom has ever known, even his 16-year-old self, who was far more guarded. Tom teaches him still, as all versions of Tom, magics and spells and tricks of awareness that Percy learns obediently and practices at home. But Tom also talks to him, shares more of his personal background than Percy would have ever believed he willing to share. He speaks of that first year at Hogwarts, how he'd struggled with wand magic, so used to the instinctive flow of his power throughout his body, of the slight he'd felt when even Slughorn had not asked him to be his apprentice, despite the many hours of Slug Club Tom had forced himself to attend, and of the indignity of working at Borgin and Burke's with two elderly, condescending wizards barely worth a second of Tom's attention, had they not had access to some of the rarest dark artifacts of the time. So yes, Tom worries him, but Percy is self-aware, reluctantly, quietly, forcefully, enough to understand that what really worries him is not how easy it would be for this Tom to take control of the Death Eaters, despite what he writes to Severus when he relates his fears, but that Percy finds himself enjoying Tom's company in a way he'd never before. It feels finally like they are equals, like Tom has noticed him, and Percy basks in it, even as he castigates himself for the weakness. He must not forget that Tom would still kill him at a moment's notice, right, if Percy ever stood in his way. He must not forget that Tom is the Dark Lord, or a version of him, and a land ruled by Tom was not necessarily better. Percy is so confused that he is almost relieved when the time comes to meet Severus, even if their task will undoubtedly be unpleasant. As the months go on, Percy finds to his surprise that he quite likes Severus as a friend too, but this, at least, makes him feel strangely proud of himself, rather than guilty or ashamed. To have won the esteem of the ferocious Severus Snape, this is one anecdote that Percy would wish he could tell his younger self, or his other self, to motivate him to continue down the path he'd so impulsively chosen. Severus, of course, does not show any similar signs of relief when the day arrives. When Severus arrives at their agreed-upon meeting place to apparate Percy into Hogwarts, he is brusque and short, pausing only to verify Percy's identity with the name of his first girlfriend, Penelope, before whisking Percy away from the small park near the ministry. They arrive in Snape's private quarters, and Percy has only a few seconds to register a large bed made with white linens opposite a stately oak chest of drawers before Severus takes an iron grip on his arm and covers him with a strong disillusionment charm. They do not speak as they make their quick way through the castle, using a series of passageways that Percy has never seen, but seem to melt open at Severus' touch. Only when they are safely ensconced within Trelawney's rooms does Severus relax, though only marginally, and remove the charm from Percy's person. Together, Severus asks shortly. Percy nods. Now that he is here, back inside Hogwarts, the memories of Landon threaten to overwhelm. Percy had been trying not to think about Landon, about how Percy had failed him, about how Landon's only crime was curiosity and a surprising streak of moral fiber. Percy had been particularly trying not to think of a letter from Sonali that he'd luckily managed to intercept before it reached Tom or any other Death Eater, which Percy has not had the courage to open. It now lays beside a similar letter sent by Tobias, and one by Mariana. Percy can imagine what each contains, and so he does not force himself to confront their realities. If he wants to save any of them now, he has to continue moving forward with intention and not succumb to sentimentality. Severus and Percy had planned to both be in the memory after some argument. There were arguments to be made on both sides, but eventually neither could justify how Percy would have broken into Hogwarts without Severus' help, nor why Severus would then leave Percy to confront Trelawney alone. "It's got to be her," Percy says gruffly, hoping he sounds believable. "I've been practicing the legilimency." The weekend prior, Percy had staged what he hopes will be months of memories of him researching different seers in Britain, trying not to think of Landon's body under the preserving charm, soon to be interred. Landon would have loved this type of subterfuge, staging fake research, dipping in and out of the Library of Archives. He brought 12 different robes and changed into them every hour, making sure to disturb the stacks of books around him or the color of the mug from which he drinks tea. He thought even to change the light streaming in through the enchanted windows. Each time he cleared up, went outside, changed, and re-entered, he'd thank Merlin that the replacement librarian was of a less conscientious breed than his muggle-born predecessor, and therefore was at home instead of monitoring his library carefully. When Dumbledore hired her, I examined her carefully, Severus snaps back, as if offended at the implication that he may have missed something. She knows nothing of a prophecy. She remembers nothing. I've never heard of this branch of legilimency either. Memory magic is notoriously vague. You are sure of the veracity of the memories produced with this method. You cannot be sure that you are creating memories that your mind wishes to see. I've been researching memory magic for years, Percy hisses back, disgruntled. It would not do for the Dark Lord to think that Percy's loyalty to his old professor is greater than that of his loyalty to his new lord. You've never thought anything I do is good enough. You're just jealous you didn't think of this first. Stay your pride, boy. I merely want what is best for our Lord. We are at the point of the war where even a small misstep can have disastrous consequences. Severus gives one final glower to Percy and then raises his voice. Sybil, a word. Sybil Trelawney clearly does not possess a nut of the sight, for she obediently comes when Severus calls and blanches in surprise to see Percy. Mr. Weasley, she wavers, her eyes large and bug-like behind her glasses. What is it that I can help you with? Surely you ought to know, Percy asks rudely, raising an eyebrow. He had taken 2 years of divination and found the subject only vaguely interesting. There are legitimate seers, and there are legitimate prophecies, but the talent seems to be inexplicably passed down by blood, and therefore cannot be replicated by study. He had enjoyed it as a history lesson, learning about some of the famous prophecies of the past, but had never seen even a glimmer in the corner of his crystal ball. You come seeking answers. An excellent deduction, given that I would be here either to arrest you for illegally maintaining residence in Hogwarts or seeking answers, says Percy with a scoff. Sit. I have need of your memories. My memories, Trelawney says weakly, though at a stern look from Severus, she takes a precarious seat on one of the large, overstuffed armchairs she favors, sinking into it nearly entirely, so that the voluminous purple fabric seems to swallow her up like a flower encasing a bug. I assure you, Mr. Weasley, if I had any memories of note, Headmaster Snape would have already ripped them from my mind. Severus stiffens, and Trelawney gives a cackle that smells strongly of vodka. Oh, yes. You think I have not noticed you rippling through my memories for the last decade, Severus. Very curious, you are, to see what I may hold within my mind. But those of us with the sight will never give up our secrets, not to intruders. Percy gives a quelling glare to Severus, who seems ready to curse Trelawney. In a way, this helps protect him from the Dark Lord's inevitable criticism. Severus can say that he repeatedly tried to see if Trelawney had anything to hide. Percy points his wand directly at Trelawney's face and says briskly, "This won't hurt a bit. Legilimens." At the same time, Severus silently casts an imperious curse, and Percy finds himself in the odd and unique experience of entering someone's mind as they are being controlled by someone else. Trelawney's mind looks rather like her chambers, a dark, colorful room, stuffed to the brim with odds and ends, and little instruments shooting off smoke and glowing crystals scattered on ornate wooden surfaces. Percy coughs, somewhere back in his body, finding the incense smell of her room somehow permeating through her mind. It is not chaotic, he supposes, not entirely disordered. She clearly has some background in occlumency or some crackpot version of it. But she is hardly an expert on defenses, and so Percy finds it easy to navigate through her mind once he settles his vertigo. Absently, he hears Severus' voice echoing through her mind. Tell us the following as if it were a prophecy, he commands. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Percy finds a likely-looking crystal, glowing an emerald green like Harry's eyes, and closes his fingers around it in her mind. This next bit will be difficult. He yanks at it and releases enough of his magic that it begins to vibrate in her mind, as if he were trying to access it by force. At the same time, he expels himself from her mind, still clutching the gem, as if bringing it to the forefront by force. But there's something about that gem, something strange, something that vibrates in Percy's mind, though he does not allow himself to linger on his suspicions. A second later, Severus changes his imperious curse, so that Trelawney's eyes roll back in her head and she begins to incant their fake prophecy. Watching the memory later, Percy has to admit a small sense of pride at the showmanship that he and Severus managed together. It looks remarkably like their shared efforts forced a repressed memory to surface. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. And the Dark Lord should beware, for if they are to duel, the elder will perish at the hands of the younger. Yet the one who is sacrificed will be the one destroyed. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the seventh month dies. Only after they perform the requisite tasks, obliviating Trelawney, exchanging a few additional barbs, and planning the construction of the memory orb, do they return silently to Severus' chambers. Percy by links to add an extra layer of protection. Percy catches a scent that feels familiar to him, But he ignores it. If Ginny is in the castle still, likely her smell is lingering on the stones, but he will do her no favors to draw attention to it. I saw something strange in Trelawney's mind, Percy says immediately upon returning to a form. I think she has heard the prophecy before. What? Severus says in surprise, the pale green of his privacy ward still fading from his wand. A revised version. No, Percy insists, thinking of the jagged edges of the green crystal in her mind. She's heard the real one before. Understanding passes between them in a heartbeat. Percy finds himself standing between Severus and the door, his wand raised. Severus, no. Still yourself, says Severus, with a strange, brittle smile, like one carved out of ice, or sculpted from stone like a gargoyle's. I have suspected for many years, though Albus never confirmed her identity for me. Percy gapes at Severus, feeling oddly humiliated for the other man, forced to work side by side with the most visible of his mistakes. And Dumbledore allowed her to work here. This is the wrong question to ask. Severus' face sours immediately, his skin sallow and his expression angry. Yes, Severus bites out the word, which falls between them like a heavy stone into a lake. And she does not remember. Severus stretches out the word, filling it with his anger. Evidently. So perhaps Dumbledore thought she may give another prophecy, Percy says thoughtfully, both because he believes it may be true and also to distract Severus, who is beginning to look quite upset. Did she? He would not tell me. Percy shivers as Severus' dark rage builds. His magic feels appropriately like a poison brewing on the fire, the flames beginning to be unbearably hot, and an acrid smell burning the back of Percy's throat. He knew what she may do and allowed her safe passage in Hogwarts. Severus, it wasn't her fault, Percy tries, holding his hands out in warning. True seers cannot control the prophecies, nor when they say them. It is not as if Dumbledore would have incited further prophecy, merely by hiring her as a professor. Severus turns to Percy then, and Percy takes an unconscious step back at the raw pain and sorrow so clearly brewing in Severus' eyes. But seers do not give prophecies without cause, the other wizard whispers, and suddenly his magic swells and drops, as if he'd applied a careful cooling charm to the side of the cauldron. It is the paradox of prediction. A true seer will give a prophecy only when someone instrumental to its telling is near. Percy frowns, turning this over in his head. He does not remember that from the divination OWL, nor from his recent bout of research. Are you sure? A second later, he concludes this is a very stupid line of inquiry, given that Severus had more cause than most to become intimately familiar in how a prophecy is given. Never mind, he says hastily. So you are saying that Dumbledore forced the prophecy out of her? Dumbledore was merely interviewing her for a position at his school, Severus says hoarsely. The dark lines of his body seem to crumple and fold, like a feather drifting through a snowbank, blanketed by the crisp white lines of his large bed behind. It was I who created a situation out of the ordinary. It was I who spied on them to hear her knowledge. It was I who brought the prophecy into being. Percy does the only thing he can do. He takes a gentle step towards Severus and touches his arm hesitantly, leading him to the bed and guiding him to sit. Percy wastes a second hesitating on where to take his own seat before he gives it up as a lost cause and settles tentatively beside, indexing with surprise the warmth of the other man's thigh pressed against his own, odd but oddly calming. Hush, he says, like his mother coming to his bedside after a night terror. He would smooth Severus' brow if he didn't think that would result in his immediate death. Don't be foolish, Severus. For one, there's nothing you can do now. Prophecy paradoxes must be like time paradoxes. They have to occur, and so they will. Severus begins to start at this, and Percy talks more quickly, sensing the end of whatever shock is rendering Severus so compliant. For another, you cannot possibly know what induced Trelawney into giving a prophecy. Perhaps it was not your presence but Dumbledore's. Perhaps Peter Pettigrew was also hiding in that pub, listening in his little rat form. Perhaps it was the Dark Lord, bidding you to spy for him. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Even if you were to live your life 100 times over, you would not know why the prophecy was said, or why it targeted Lily and Harry Potter. Percy flinches, expecting an incendiary response, but Severus only looks at him, a little lost, and more than a bit haunted. Do you think so? Take it from me. says Percy, trying for humor to lighten the burden. What I do know is dwarfed 1,000,000 times over by what I do not know, by what I will never know. You cannot torture yourself thusly. All we can do is honor the life that Lily gave to the cause. For several long seconds, Severus is very still as he contemplates this. Then he stirs, the movement dragging his leg against Percy's. Die with grace. I'm sorry. The best we can do is die with grace and hope for absolution in the life after this. Percy suddenly thinks of Flamel, locked in his magicless cage for nearly 1,000 years, a net woven from the rough strands of his eternal regret. He shudders at the thought. We're almost done, Severus, he says, pressing his knee more purposefully against Severus, in the hopes it may bring comfort. We are almost done, and then we will be free, one way or another. Asterisk, he cares so much about mudbloods, says Tom later that day, as they walk through the streets of Diagon Alley, surveying the result of the Dark Lord's latest raid. He had gone and personally murdered 4 separate shopkeepers, all half-blood, though of course tomorrow's prophet will declare them to be violent thieves and liars, and neither Tom nor Percy know why. I do not think I ever cared quite so much, even as a boy. Percy is still feeling rather weak and tired from his sleepless night and the confrontation with the seer, and the large takeaway coffee he is clutching in his hands is not providing the type of support he'd expected when forking over nearly an entire half-galleon for it at the cafe. Raise the issue of inflation with the goblins, he adds to his mental matrix, which flutters angrily down to his mental desk. Percy wants to rub at his throbbing temples, but does not want to point Tom toward his mental ineptitude. As a result, all he can muster up is a weak, "It is odd." Tom, luckily, does not need very much encouragement to continue speaking. He stops at the storefront of one of the affected vendors. It had been an ice cream shop, if Percy is remembering correctly, though even in his childhood he had rarely been treated to such a luxury. In the first timeline, he'd sometimes accompanied his mother alone to run her errands, his other siblings spurning what they felt was a boring use of their time, and she would occasionally reward him with a treat, though Percy had always preferred a little book or a block of chocolate, something more lasting, and whose consumption he could control himself over the next few weeks. I wonder why, Tom says thoughtfully, towing at some of the dust and grime with a dragon-hide-covered foot. Absently, Percy wonders how Tom has been funding his new lifestyle. He does not seem to eat nor sleep, but still, his new robes are not particularly cheap. Percy starts as he realizes that Tom is waiting impatiently for him to provide the next question to lead into whatever thought Tom is brewing within his active mind. Why he cares about mudbloods? Tom nods. They look at their reflections in what is left of the shattered glass. The Dark Lord had preserved enough of the original lettering on the shop so that its identity would be clearly recognizable. No two flavors alike. I mean, of course everyone in Slytherin cares about mudbloods, Tom muses, narrowing his eyes at his reflection. They are dirtier than us and quite unpleasant to be around. I, of course, quickly identified that one of the easiest ways to stir a group of purebloods was to point them in the direction of a few undeserving mudbloods and stand back. But he seems to be taking his dislike rather to the next level. Percy takes another optimistic sip of his coffee, but the bitter tang of the magically warmed liquid does nothing to dispel his growing headache nor his unease. Sipping the drink does, however, occupy his mouth for long enough that he does not churlishly point out that Tom is being rather forgiving of his past self to claim that he used the issue of mudbloods merely as a rallying device. Percy has seen some choice memories that would beg otherwise, but it is true that the Dark Lord seems to split his time between hunting down mudbloods, wands, and Harry Potter. Percy has not seen him lately. There had been a time where Percy had felt, not close to the Dark Lord, but perhaps proximate to the point where he'd started to feel like he understood him. But once again, the Dark Lord has sequestered himself away on a mission unbeknownst to anyone save his most privileged followers. Even Severus had only said darkly that he suspected it had to do with Lucius, but he did not know. It's no different than any of the other purebloods, Percy says after another fortifying sip of coffee. Tom quirks an eyebrow, still facing their reflection. Percy watches his face watch Tom. What do you mean? Well, why do these purebloods care so much about mudbloods? They're dirty, sure, but so are animals. And you don't see the likes of Malfoy and Yaxley murdering every animal in the forest, Percy points out. He may not feel close to the Dark Lord, but he is rather close to the Dark Lord's followers. They care because they feel stymied and weak, and as if they are not getting the respect they feel they deserve, and like perhaps after they walk out of the room, everyone begins to mock them. It's easier to look down on mudbloods than to confront that. An interesting read, comments Tom. And you believe he is like this too? Percy waves his hand to encompass all of Diagon Alley and the rest of Britain besides. He has everything, everything, and still he does not have Harry Potter, and still his opponents insist on squirreling away the mudbloods to other countries, and still you murdered his snake, and still people do not respect him. You think people do not respect him. Percy thinks about it, about everyone he's met in the ministry and in line for coffee and at the bank, the way they flinch when they see him coming, but continue to live their lives regardless. They fear him, he says finally, but they do not respect him, and fear is not tenable, not unless it is continually renewed. Do you know that people have begun to file for marriage licenses again? Job applications for the ministry are back up as well. People can adjust to fear. Tom is very quiet as they stand for a few more minutes, staring in the shop. Then he turns on his heel abruptly and strides away, disappearing before he reaches the end of the street. Percy is left alone, clutching his coffee and hoping desperately he had not just said something tremendously stupid. But as the days continue to pass, some tortuously slowly and some with staggering speed, Percy cannot find he regrets what he said. Fear is not tenable. Certainly even the Muggle-borns in Azkaban are afraid. But when Percy goes with Pews to check on their condition, he finds that many of them are defiant and angry, too. Certainly the British populace is afraid, but they've always been able to adjust, and many of them still remember the wards and precautions from the First War and have become proficient in their use for this one too. And as Percy finds out, certainly the Death Eaters are afraid, and surprisingly have more cause than most to be afraid, given their proximity to the Dark Lord and their insight into his power. But their fear wars with their natural proud inclinations, which Percy finds out almost by accident when Yaxley invites him to a casual dinner that is nothing short of treacherous. Cypress Parkinson is not there, of course, and neither is not. In truth, Yaxley ought not to be there either, but Percy knows that if there's one thing Yaxley cannot stand, it is to be disdained or excluded. But the others who do attend are many of the same familiar faces from those earlier gatherings hosted by Lucius, the elder wizards or their elder children, those who begun to accumulate power before the Dark Lord's return and are not particularly pleased to give it up without reward. Nobody outwardly complains, of course. The Dark Lord's name is not even mentioned, though Avery, the elder, father of Percy's old classmate, the one whose son and daughter-in-law were killed so carelessly by Tom, pointedly toasts to his health at the beginning of the meal with glasses of the finest elf-made wine. But Percy, who has become far more attuned to the barely perceptible tremors of nuance in these types of pureblood plays, can see as if through a disillusionment charm. They talk, carelessly, boastfully, of the laws they want to propose, and reminisce over the battles they'd fought in the past. There is an undercurrent of irony, for though the Wisengamot is in session, nobody would dare to propose something contrary to the Dark Lord's beliefs. When they ask Percy about the minister's approval rating, they do so only out of politeness, because of course it does not matter whether the minister is popular, only that Percy and Yaxley control him to the Dark Lord's satisfaction. They speak of their family manners, of reducing household staff at the main residence, of suddenly requiring vaguely complex renovations at their alternate homes, renovations that require nearly all of their house elves to be moved, or their wives to be relocated to oversee the process, or money to be preemptively withdrawn from Gringotts, and those without family houses jostle for invitations. And they do not criticize the Dark Lord, of course, but they ask Yaxley and then Percy lightly, casually about the Dark Lord's plans for the next year, and then express polite, non-committal surprise at their lack of clarity. They do not criticize the Dark Lord with their words, but rather through every graceful, elegant motion of their wealthy bodies, every polished, artful word from their carefully guarded lips, through every subtle, intentional action, and Percy cannot help but wonder how the Dark Lord is blind to the challenge brewing right beneath his nose, or lack thereof. Percy has so much on his mind that he is nearly an hour late to his next summons to Parkinson Manor. He had to put Pews to rights before the next day, giving him a set of instructions to carry him through the day's meetings. He had to surreptitiously pass a message to Tonks, loitering by the entrance of the ministry, smoking a large Muggle cigarette. He had to scratch out a quick update for Severus, and nearly as an afterthought, he had to snag a take-away meal from the ministry cafeteria, a disgusting turkey wrap that has wilted lettuce even a strong freshening charm can't save. Percy is still running his tongue around his teeth, searching for that elusive piece of lettuce, when he bows his way into the main ballroom, casting a nonverbal charm to quiet his footsteps so they do not draw attention to his late arrival. Yet his footsteps echo nevertheless. Percy looks up, and a second later thanks his instincts, as something tells him to throw his body onto the floor in supplication. Percy pulls frantically at his shields to erect strong barriers, armored knights moving into position, having not thought to take the time to prepare a full meditation. "You're getting sloppy, Weasley," he scolds himself, even as he mumbles an apology through numbed lips. For the summons he had received was for a private audience with the Dark Lord, a Dark Lord who had now been waiting nearly an hour for Percy to deign to show up. The curse, when it comes, is expected. Percy lays panting after it's lifted, feeling a sob caught in his throat, which had felt like a wolf had torn it out of his body with its jaws. It takes him several agonized seconds to come back to himself and pull himself to his knees. "My apologies, my lord," Percy says again, massaging his throat nervously with one hand. He glances up cautiously to see the Dark Lord sitting upright in his throne, nearly vibrating with impatient energy. But not impatient bad, Percy realizes, his senses highly attuned to every nuance in Voldemort's magic and mood. Impatient sly, impatient playful, like he has a toy to torment Percy with, a toy he is eager to display. Percy thinks suddenly of golden goblets displayed on a sideboard and hopes to Merlin that the toy does not have red hair and a blood traitor last name. "What form did the Cruciatus take for you, Percival?" The Dark Lord asks, opening his dialogue with a bit of a non sequitur. Percy is familiar with this tactic. Tom uses it as well to disarm his opponent before striking the killing blow. "A wolf, my lord," Percy responds carefully. His hand rises again to his throat as he explains, "as if it tore out my throat." "Fascinating," the Dark Lord breathes, genuine curiosity lighting the ember of his eerie red eyes. "Do you have a particular fear of wolves?" "Not before today, my lord," Percy says honestly, and the Dark Lord rewards him with a laugh. Feeling a bit emboldened, Percy ventures, "I've always found the Cruciatus to be an interesting spell, my lord. My own experiences with it have been limited, on the casting end, of course. I'm afraid my experiences on the receiving end have been far more frequent than I would have hoped, which is, of course, my fault for not being worthy." He tacks on this last nearly belatedly, after realizing that the latter part of his sentence had sounded almost accusatory of the Dark Lord. But his luck holds, and the Dark Lord merely chuckles again and waves him on. "As a caster, I do not consciously choose the form of torture that the victim feels, and yet it is unique to each person and to each instance of the spell. It is mental and physical, though of course it leaves no permanent physical marks." The Dark Lord nods eagerly. "Most fascinating of the unforgivables, I would say," he says, though Tom had at one point told Percy he was the most fascinated by the Imperious. Then the academic, amiable atmosphere drops from the room like a towel sliding off a hook and spooling at Percy's feet. "I wish to speak to you, Percival, about the acquaintance we both share." "Tom." Every ounce of Percy's body screams in fear, which he is sure shows on his face, for the Dark Lord laughs again, and this time it is high and thin and cruel. "Oh, yes. I have allowed your relationship with him to occur unchecked for present, but I wanted to inform you personally that his time will soon be over." Oh, Tom. Oh, Merlin. Of all the ways that Percy had envisioned losing Tom, he hadn't thought Tom would be stupid enough to threaten the Dark Lord so openly that the Dark Lord had to assert himself against Tom. And if Tom had been captured or destroyed, then what did that mean? That the Dark Lord was more powerful, despite Tom's claims to the contrary? I had assumed you knew of our continued association, my lord, or I would have come to you sooner, Percy says hesitantly. Oh, what had Tom revealed? Had Tom sacrificed Percy for his own gains? Is Percy about to die? He feels dizzy, and the room swims in front of him. Relax, Percival, chides the Dark Lord, and then the unthinkable happens. He conjures up a chair, the same style of chair Percy cannot help but notice, that darts the classrooms at Hogwarts and motions for Percy to sit. Percy takes a seat, gripping the edges of the wooden chair as if they are tethering him to life. He must be about to die. He cannot imagine the Dark Lord would allow him to live after affording him such an unexpected honor as being seated so casually. Matching bathrooms, says Myrtle in Percy's memories, and Percy feels warmed. If he is to die, so be it. He will not reveal anything. Tamping down on his panic, he straightens his spine and tries to calm his moist face. You are young and well-versed in magics, Voldemort says lightly. More than my other followers, save for perhaps Severus and Lucius. Tell me, Percival, what do you know of Grindelwald? Whatever Percy had been expecting Voldemort to ask, that had not been it. Not as much as I ought to, I suppose, Percy says, excusing himself. I know, of course, of his rise to power and of Dumbledore's defeat of him. He has been imprisoned since then. Have you ever heard of a wand referred to as the Death Stick? Even the memory of Myrtle's warm laughter in Percy's ear isn't enough to calm him. Sweat drips wetly down Percy's back, hidden, hopefully, by his opulent purple robes. Yes, my lord. I believe it to be a fairy tale, a myth, though I did hear rumors that Dumbledore's power was derived from such a wand. It was, confirms the Dark Lord lightly. And then Lucius stole it, though it is no matter. Lucius has promised to return it to me in exchange for the lives of his wife and son. He will have to die, of course, but he knew that would be an eventuality when he made off with it from Dumbledore's tomb. Grindelwald was the wand's last confirmed owner. I have sent Lucius to speak to him to see if Dumbledore truly inherited it. So the Dark Lord was in contact with Lucius, and Lucius had promised to return the wand, but not yet betrayed Severus and Percy. Why? Percy knows that Lucius would not hold his tongue unless he planned to use the information later for increased gain. Wherever Draco is, he will have to be on his guard. Percy would not put it past Lucius to find his son and kill anything in his path in order to find the Elder Wand and return it to the Dark Lord. And what better time for Lucius to tell the Dark Lord about Severus' betrayals than after he's presented his master with an unbeatable wand? I am telling you this because you have no ambition to defeat me, the Dark Lord says, almost tenderly. I have seen his memories of you, Percival. You have cared for my soul as if it were your own. The words echo in the cavernous room, a white bed, fingers on his throat, lips brushing against his. I swore a vow, my lord, Percy croaks, his throat impassably dry, that I would never harm any part of your soul. Yes, the Dark Lord agrees, regarding Percy. So Tom said, tell me, Percival, have you heard of a sworn companion? Not precisely, my lord, Percy hedges. An apprentice was at one point a sworn companion, the Dark Lord lectures, sounding terribly like Tom as his voice falls into a teaching cadence. Traditionally, apprentices gave their masters a single gold coin and a book of parchment and bade themselves into their master's care. But the practice of sworn companions preceded even that of the ancient apprentices. You have heard of Merlin and Arthur, I believe. Arthur went to the warlock Merlin and swore to be his companion, his loyal servant, his sword kept in its sheath, his staff resting against the tree. Despite himself, Percy is spellbound, caught up in the web that the Dark Lord weaves for them both with his words. Merlin was a powerful wizard, and many did not understand why he would need Arthur, a young and untrained knight, though the son of a king, to follow behind him. But Merlin knew that his power was limited, bade to him by the ancient gods, stemming from the land and the sky and the magic of the earth. He was only as powerful as the earth and as fallible, so he turned to Arthur to augment his power. He drew on Arthur's magic, says Percy, his eyes wide. He used Arthur like a wand, to focus his magic, to augment his power, and to extend his reach, confirms the Dark Lord. Something in the formal cadence of his tones reminds Percy of McGonagall. And so we begin with our own minds. It's where the dark mark comes from, isn't it? Percy asks, his hand creeping over his forearm to trace around the outline of the snake. The Dark Lord starts, but then a smile begins to play along his thin, lipless mouth. Yes, all of my loyal followers are to me as Arthur was to Merlin. But Merlin knew that his power would die with Arthur, and so he gave to Arthur a choice, to swear to be by his side forever, so that he may live with Merlin, or to die a mortal death and be forgot. And Percy cannot help but ask eagerly, and Arthur denied it. He wished to be king of his own people, not understanding that to be Merlin's companion would be to be elevated beyond the court of mere mortals. Here the Dark Lord turns his attention on Percy. It burns on Percy's skin like a brand. You understand what I am saying? Yes, my lord. And Percy does, and for one terrible second he is tempted. To live by the Dark Lord, to live by his magic, to be with Tom until the ends of the earth. And Tom, what of him? The Dark Lord rests his fingers casually on the new wand in his possession. With these new instruments of power that I have discovered, I have no need for things such as him, he says casually. Percy has to wonder, had he found the other Hallows or believed himself to have found them? Did he know of Harry's role in this too? Particularly those tempted to betray me for their own ends. So you will destroy him. Percy manages at the last second to not say them. The Dark Lord peers closely at Percy. Does that sadden you, Percival? It does, my lord, Percy admits. But he is merely a shadow of you. Everything I sought in him, I find in you dozens of times over. This answer pleases the Dark Lord, Percy can tell. Voldemort crosses his legs and leans back, cocking his head and looking very much human. I am nearly done securing my place in eternity, he says calmly, as if reporting on a potion. And then I will destroy Harry Potter, and I will not have enemies. What would you do next? Put on the spot, Percy has to resist the urge to fidget uncomfortably. He does not try to demur or avoid the question. The Dark Lord does not like prevarication. Better to say something steadfastly and incorrectly than fumble his way toward what he thinks the Dark Lord would like to hear. But Percy has an advantage through the many years of discussing such topics with Tom. In truth, I care not for issues of blood purity, he admits, staring at his white-knuckled hands. I do not like muggles, but I think of them as animals, something necessary to sustain their own populations, but not something I wish to ever interact with myself. The issue of mudbloods I would like to explore further. I am not convinced that mudbloods are not descendants of squibs, briefly lost to us, and then brought back into our society. I am happy to take whatever you decree as the truth, my lord, for these questions of blood purity are beyond the realm of my knowledge. It is a rather politically expedient issue, but magically questionable, agrees the Dark Lord, as if they are discussing a political party rather than the Dark Lord's regime. I would be interested to see what your research unearths, Percival. Percy hurries forward. The only thing that I believe should matter is magic. Magic is merit, but we need those less powerful to fill important roles in our society. He waves his hand to encompass the entire ministry. I can't get a cup of decent tea in the ministry, since no pureblood wants to be the one to brew it for me, even if he is barely a step above a squib. The Dark Lord laughs loudly and fully, the sound reverberating in Percy's chest. So you do not wish to kill all mudbloods or squibs, but slot them into their rightful place, based on their magical ability. Yes, says Percy, praying it is the correct answer. Society will always need echelons. The Dark Lord sits once again like a wizard on a throne, signaling to Percy that their brief discourse is over. Interestingly put, he says. You must think of what I have proposed, and give me your answer when I require it of you. Yes, my lord, Percy says, ducking his head. Later that night, he sits at his bed and tries to write to Severus, but he cannot muster up any words to describe that strange and unprecedented experience. But the offer warms him. He cannot say that it does not, though of course he cannot accept the offer, nor consider allying himself forever with the darkest wizard of their time. But the Dark Lord is the greatest wizard of their time too, greater than Harry or Dumbledore or Grindelwald. For the first time, Percy mourns what became of Tom not for Tom's sake, but for his own. Had Tom become a professor of Hogwarts, had he been a prominent wizard of learning, had he opened his doors to those interested in studying under his tutelage? Percy wishes desperately he could have met the Dark Lord in another life. In a life where the only cost he would pay to learn from him was a galleon and a thin notebook of parchment, rather than his soul, and the lives of all he holds dear. But Tom has not been captured, at least not yet. Percy finds him in the minister's office the very next day, waiting eagerly for Percy to arrive, creating small ice snakes out of his magic to writhe over the minister's desk to entertain himself. Tom, Percy says in surprise. Tom, I had a meeting with the Dark Lord yesterday. He told me, well, he all but threatened you. I thought you disappeared. Tom rolls his eyes, holding out his hand for one of the snakes to crawl languidly up his fingers. He's always threatening me. Did he tell you that Lucius has promised him the Elder Wand? What a load of rubbish. He's scared, Percy. He's reaching for fairy tales. Well, of course, the Elder Wand is but a myth, Percy says carefully. But Tom, I've seen his magic personally. You're strong, but he can challenge you. Nobody can challenge me. Tom closes his fingers around the snake, which melts in his hand and releases small eddies of magic back into the air. But you make a good point, I suppose. I examined the boy when he was standing near me. The soul fragment in him is weak, and I do not know how his soul or the prophecy may have affected it. I do not think I need to extract it. So, Percy prompts Tom slowly. What are you implying? You would not find it difficult to determine the prophecy, would you? Tom counters, raising an eyebrow shrewdly. Certainly you have members of the order you could reach out to should it become necessary. Tom, one of your more reasonable brothers, perhaps, or your transfiguration professor. I am not upset. You know, as do I, that once you reveal the words of the prophecy to him, he will act on it. He could bring the boy to him at any moment, merely by kidnapping one of his many loyal friends. It is only his fear of the unknown, and of me, that is staying his hand. Tom's derisive tone makes it clear what he thinks of Harry's weakness in this manner, or perhaps Voldemort's. But you also know that the moment the prophecy has been fulfilled, I will defeat the Dark Lord, and I believe that something in you is afraid of this outcome. I am not afraid, Percy protests. Tom has, of course, missed the critical part of Percy's calculation. They need to destroy the locket if they are to have any hopes of ending everything in one fell swoop, and Percy needs to find a way to open said locket, considering his Parseltongue orbs are no longer functional, and the boy who lived is not obeying his instructions. But Percy cannot say that, of course. Are you worried I will forget about you? Tom's amusement rankles Percy, who cannot help but scowl petulantly. But what can he say that will explain his hesitancy to give the Dark Lord the prophecy, and thus enable Tom to defeat the Dark Lord once the prophecy is fulfilled? What if confronting the Dark Lord results in your harm? Percy asks, raising his eyes to meet Tom's. I am not worried that you will forget me, Tom. We have been through much together. He feels the traitorous burn begin to flood his cheeks and hurries on. But prophecies are notoriously unpredictable. But that is not what you are afraid of, says Tom quietly. You do not believe in prophecy. I can tell that you do not believe you will discover anything of note by pursuing the seer of the Dark Lord's prophecy. Why do you fear me still, Percy? Have I given you cause to believe I cannot be trusted? Percy's cheeks tint, but he finds it difficult to look away from the intensity of Tom's gaze. Everything that remains unsaid hovers in the mist between them, as insubstantial as Percy's patroness form. Tell me, Percy, continues Tom enticingly. He takes a small step forward, so that his magic washes over Percy, causing him to shiver from the sudden cold. We are partners, you know, perhaps in more ways than one. What do you plan to do? Percy says quietly, the words coaxed from him by the strange glint in Tom's eyes, and the way his own magic opens up to meet Tom's. Will you do when you are unchallenged? Will you leave the country and not return? Will you continue in the Dark Lord's stead? And this uncertainty worries you. Tom raises an eyebrow and turns, perching on the top of the minister's desk like a small, lithe bird, the sinuous lines of his body in contrast to the sharp edges of the wood below. Percy bristles, anticipating a dismissive answer, but to his surprise, Tom continues to look away from him as he says softly, In truth, it worries me too. I have my memories from this life, and the lives I lived before, and ghost memories of those who have interacted with the diadem. I have the privilege of hindsight, in a way. I can see how some of the plans I made were corrupted, while others discarded. But to truly take his future as mine is to imply that we are the same, and I cannot believe that, not really. It is like looking into a looking glass, and seeing only a distorted version of yourself. Percy thinks suddenly of his 17th birthday, of the mirror in the burrow, of his strange double reflection, 30 and 17 together. Or rather, seeing multiple versions of yourself. All of the versions of you that you have been, and those that you could be, and those that you hope not to be, and those that you plan to be. You see them all, but you do not recognize which is you. Tom's voice is a study in nonchalance when he observes. You speak as if from experience. For a sliver of a second, Percy has the crazy desire to tell Tom why he understands what it is like to wake in a time that is not his own, to live a life that hovers just barely on top of the life he has already lived. Of course, he can do no such thing, so instead he only says, I have a lot of practice not liking who I have been, Tom, or regretting who I may become. But what you have is a gift. You have seen one possible future of yourself, and you can choose to reject it and forge your own path. And this is the path you've chosen to forge for yourself. Tom glances back, as if he cannot help himself, and Percy flinches at the spark that flashes between them as their eyes graze each other's line of sight. How do you know that you are on the correct path? I don't, admits Percy. And I spend most of my time doubting myself, as I'm sure you've noticed. But Tom, that sort of decision, that gift, if you will, does not just arrive once and then leave. In theory, we can continually reevaluate and decide to be a different version of ourselves if we do not like who we see in the mirror. Realizing suddenly that his voice had changed, as if speaking to a peer rather than to Tom, Percy gives a guilty start and then tacks on, at least that's what I tell myself. It's probably a load of rubbish. Probably, agrees Tom, but his face is thoughtful. When Percy finally manages to corner Tonks, he leaves a preserved turkey sandwich outside the East Ministry entrance, one of the signals she'd concocted for when he needed to speak to her. He only has a few minutes for her, and what she has to say is not encouraging. Harry has not been to the house at all, though Remus has, and he reports that the Dark Lord is marshalling his dark forces, clearly preparing for a confrontation of some sort. Percy tells Tonks that he expects the same, though with Landon now gone, the escape network leading into France has been not destroyed, Tonks mutters lowly, looking around them nervously. She is disguised as one of their old classmates, perfectly pureblood and an acceptable person for Percy to speak to for a few minutes, but of course it never pays to let one's guard down. Stalled. There's going to be a breakout of Azkaban. Been planning it with Cedric. Percy smiles blandly, though of course he's quite shocked. He'll be furious. There will likely be retribution. We've been making portkeys by the bushel, thanks to your instructions, Tonks mutters, pretending to flip through her schedule book, as if to pencil in Percy for lunch. Yaxley comes up the hall and spots Percy speaking to an attractive pureblood witch and feels the need to leer playfully at Percy, which Tonks manages to ignore with all the grace of an auror on a mission. We figure the time for subtlety is long gone. Get 'em all out while we can. You better get them all out if you try that. Everyone left will be killed, Percy says snappishly, sending a marginally rude gesture to Yaxley behind his back. You can do a lot more damage with that many portkeys if you act with more subtlety. Put a notice in a Muggle newspaper or something, let everyone know where they can find a portkey. Make it difficult to understand unless you've got the password, and don't direct the portkey to anywhere sensitive, so if a snatcher gets a hold of it, you're not all bollocksed up. So hopefully, Percy thinks later that night, he's avoided the kind of disaster that seemed to follow the Order around in the First War. A bold stand, followed by a show of revenge that inevitably harms more people than the initial stand helped. Of course, when the trio breaks into Gringotts 2 days later, it all becomes a moot point. The absolute fucking imbeciles. When Percy reads the large headline in the next morning's Prophet, he sets his tea down and spends a very satisfying moment unleashing every curse word that he knows. It seems that Harry, in true Chosen One fashion, has taken the decision to act out of everyone's hands. Severus, Percy's, Tom's, and the Dark Lord's, for such an outright act of aggression, cannot be ignored. Percy takes a long minute to clear his mind before he stands, his face grim. If Harry has brought the war to their doorstep, then it will take all of Percy's skill, both with magic and with calculation, to stay a step ahead, hovering in the air seconds ahead of Harry, ready to dive in and take action as needed. It's time, he writes to Severus, though Severus is likely already with the Dark Lord, and will not be able to respond. The words look so empty on the page that Percy writes them again, just to convince himself, to make it more real. It's time. Merlin, help us all. And he closes the book and stands to go to work. There will be much to be done and very little room for error.